Mustafa. Wonderful to see you again.
It's great to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining me for coffee this morning. Cheers. So Mustafa, you are now the Vice President for Environmental Justice, Climate, and Community Revitalization for the National Wildlife Federation. And before joining the Federation, you were the Senior VP for the Hip Hop Caucus, which is a national organization that connects the hip hop community to the civic process to create positive change. And prior to joining the Hip Hop Caucus, you worked for 24 years at the US EPA, and most recently served as Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice and Community Revitalization there. So the last time I talked to you, or we saw each other in person, you were still with the Hip Hop Caucus. So I'd love to know how the issues of environmental justice, climate, and community revitalization integrate into your work at the National Wildlife Federation.
Sure. Well, you know, the National Wildlife Federation has over 6 million members, which, you know, that's a lot of folks. And of course, there are a lot of folks that give you an opportunity to also hopefully get them focused on the impacts that are happening in our most vulnerable communities. And it's funny, you know, folks would be like, well, why did you go to the National Wildlife Federation? And one, I like a challenge. But two, you know, Colin O'Mara, the president, young president, said he wanted to create a 21st century organization. You know, sometimes we create these barriers, these walls between organizations, between issues, and fail to realize the commonalities that exist in that space. So that same pollution that is making, you know, Black and brown communities sick and causing their lives to be shortened is the same pollution that is killing wildlife, that is damaging our natural spaces. And it's an opportunity for us to actually build bridges between different sets of groups who in many instances are working sometimes in the same areas, literally, but have not yet engaged with each other because there could have been misunderstandings or bad relationships or a number of things in the past that have created this separation. And when we talk about winning on environmental injustice issues, when we talk about winning on climate change issues, we know that it's going to take everyone. It is impossible for us to win on these issues if we don't build these very authentic and powerful coalitions of numbers of different types of people to be able to move forward. And, you know, and it's amazing. You know, most folks know I've worked on air pollution, water pollution issues, public health issues, housing, transportation, so forth and so on. You know, when I look at our national parks, you know, almost 90% of our national parks are now dealing with significant air pollution issues. And as I remind folks, that air pollution is coming from those Black and brown and lower wealth white communities, and sometimes from indigenous land, where we've placed, you know, all of these toxic facilities that are burning, you know, fossil fuels, that are emitting all these toxic chemicals that then leave after they've impacted those communities and begin to drift, you know, into other locations where folks may sometimes think that they're safe, that they think that these are supposed to be pristine locations. And yes, they are, but they're now also being impacted. So that connection that exists between what's happening in Black and brown and lower wealth white communities and indigenous folks and what's going on in these other spaces is becoming much more clear to folks and giving people a better understanding of why we must work in authentic collaborative partnerships. And I'll say that again, authentic collaborative partnerships. That means we're not pimping people's pain. We're not taking advantage of the communities and the front lines who've been doing the work. We have to figure out ways to work together in a real substantive way.
So you've had an amazing career path, building bridges and advocating for climate and environmental justice. What positive changes have you seen over time, and where are the biggest opportunities for making progress looking forward?
Sure. Well, we've got a lot more accountability in the system than we did before. I remember, and some folks have heard me tell the story, that when I was a student, I was going to the first environmental equity meeting, which became environmental justice a couple of years later. There were two older white gentlemen who were walking in front of me. And at that time, I looked like I was about 14 or 15 years old. And I remember them saying, and remember, these were folks who were working for EPA at that time, I don't know why we're going to these meetings, because what these folks are sharing can't possibly be happening in our country. They must be lying. That was the mentality at that time in the 90s around these issues. Fast forward to today, you no longer have to convince folks about, that environmental justice, environmental racism, environmental injustice is real. So that is a hurdle that you no longer have to jump over. It's very similar to climate change, where we've had these climate deniers, for a number of years as well. And now, the majority of Americans, the majority of people across the planet know that climate change is real. The question is, how do you best address these issues? Also, over time, you've got all kinds of new partners who've come into the space. The research is there now, right? So in the early days, there were only, 2 or 3 studies that were out there. Now, literally, there are thousands upon thousands of studies that are out there that anchor these issues in the science, which is important, because the science will also help us, along with policy, to understand the directions that we can go and that we must go. And then you bring great minds together to figure out the intricacies of what does that actually look like. There's so many young people who are now engaged, who, they are wondering, why hasn't this been fixed in the past? They're saying that, okay, we will work with our elders and we will work in an intergenerational way, but if you're not willing to do everything that's necessary, we will use our innovation. We will use our energy to make sure that this is a reality, because the isms of the past that many of our parents, grandparents, maybe even ourselves got hung up on and, were sort of infused into many of us, ageism, sexism, racism is not something that is acceptable to the younger generation. You see their movements they look like America. They look like the world, which is where we've all said we want to be. So, with that change going on also, it's powerful. And then the other aspect that I'll share before we transition to the next question is that, in the early days, there was nothing on statute side, on executive order side, on any of the laws that were necessary beyond the existing ones that we had that should have been fully protecting people. And what I mean by that is the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, RCRA, Superfund, your Right to Know Acts, all these things, if they'd had the foresight to actually make sure that they were truly inclusive of all the needs of all the people, then we would have been okay. But we know sometimes there are gaps in our policies, right? Our policies have racism and biases, unfortunately, that have been built into them or an outcome from them. But now we have, on the state level, environmental justice laws. On the federal level, there has been, over the last year, about 20 different laws that have been introduced. And hopefully one day we will have a Congress that actually passes them. Of course, we have Executive Order 12898 that President Clinton signed in 1994. So we are at such a different time, but we still got some work to do. But we've got foundational pieces and elements that are now in place that can really help us to better protect folks.
So we have these historic challenges, and now we have COVID-19, and COVID and climate change are both public health issues that are affecting communities of color at much higher rate and more devastating rates than other communities. So as we try to build back better, how can we ensure that the strategies and actions are addressing this reality?
Well, first we have to start with the fact that when you hear people say, I can't breathe, or we can't breathe, there's reality that is built into that and is anchored to that. So then we have to ask the question, as we are thinking about how do we critically make sure that legislation and policy is doing what it's supposed to do, then we have to ask, well, why are there gaps in that? And of course, that is tied to systemic racism. And we have to be equally understanding the impact that that has, so that we make sure that anything we create is moving us in a positive direction and not anchoring us to the past or to something that's negative. So in unpacking that, we understand it disproportionately that these facilities, these emitters of toxic pollution are located in certain communities. So around zoning, And we know restrictive covenants and redlining in the past played a role, but it also still plays a role. If you look at some things that the current administration has done in the banking space, making it more difficult for folks to be able to access capital. If you look at some of the things that have been shared from the current administration around making the suburbs safe for you to be able to live in, is all tied up in policy. And we have to make sure that we don't eliminate what some of those actions are trying to do, to be able to flip the script, if you will, to make sure that it is actually focused in a direction where people are being protected. What we can do on the policy side also is make sure that there's truly an environmental justice analysis for all of both the federal and state laws. That will change the game. I've worked with folks on Capitol Hill, on understanding what that is and making sure that it gets integrated into the various bills that we have out there. It will help us on the side around the environmental injustices that are happening. It will also help us on the climate side because, tool creation, resources, and policy development will all be influenced by that, by making sure that we are not having additional impacts and that we are also focusing on the benefits that many of the communities need to have. And as I share with everyone, most people now get it. There's still a few folks who are still dealing with antiquated ways of looking at climate change. We cannot win on climate change if we don't win on environmental justice. And the reason I say that is because, once again, the fossil fuel facilities are primarily located in those communities. If you look at the infrastructure, right, we got 2.4 million miles of pipeline in our country, fossil fuel pipeline. That's enough to go to the moon and back, and on your way again to the moon. So what that means is that if we understand that that pipeline is running through lower wealth white communities, through farmland, ending up many instances in Black and brown communities on our coast, then if we're having those analysis, then we will be able to make sure that we don't really need to create any more of that. And how can we change that dynamic through a just transition or other operations to be able to create more economic opportunities, then that's it. The other part of that is that you also have to look at deforestation, which we know is a driver in agricultural policies as well. So if we're looking at an EJ analysis in that space, then we know that most of the folks who've been defending those forests and those jungles, which are the lungs of our planet, have been Black and brown folks, right? So if we're looking through that analysis, once again, we can make sure that, we're protecting, those communities and those folks who've literally been giving their lives, sometimes for millennia, in how long they've been living there, but definitely since the Industrial Revolution, they have been the ones who have been trying to send us a message, right? To honor Mother Earth, which is the first principle of the environmental justice movement. All of this comes together in policy and the decisions that we will make about resources and resource distribution, but also in accountability. And, what are the enforcement and compliance mechanisms that will be there? Let's make sure there's an EJ analysis so that we make sure that that social safety net that so many of us talk about, that there's no gaps in it and everybody is actually protected.
Mustafa, what gives you hope that we can win on climate change and environmental justice?
We don't have a choice. I mean, literally. And that's the thing that, the conversation 20 years ago seemed like a sci-fi movie because people were like, well, those types of things couldn't possibly happen, right? We couldn't have biblical floods back to back to back, year after year in same areas. We could never have these mega wildfires. We might have a wildfire, but not mega wildfires again and again and again. We couldn't possibly have Cat 5 hurricanes smashing into the Gulf Coast time and time and time again and taking out islands. Folks now realize that, those conversations that seemed like they were impossible 20 years ago are now the reality that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So I know without a doubt that we have to win on this. And I know without a doubt that there are now enough people who are saying we've got to do something, that real change is going to happen. There is a cultural shift that is happening in our country and around the planet. There's a cultural shift in relationship to, racism and that no longer being accepted. There is a cultural shift that is also happening around climate change. And a lot of it is being driven by younger people and those who have been, trying to share for a long time. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. It's interesting, if you go back to the early days of the environmental movement, in the late 60s, early 70s, creatives played a huge role, just like they did in the civil rights movement, even though they may not get as much attention as Dr. King or some of the folks in the environmental movement. But, music, poetry, the arts was a galvanizing force, if you will. And then we lost it as we began to move through time. And now we're at this moment where we are trying to expand and connect. And creatives, for me, is one of the most important elements that have to be authentically infused into what's going on. Because, we all know thousands of great scientists, and they are critically important in the work that we do. But I can line up 1,000 scientists here in front of us. And if they share something, folks might remember 10% of what they said. But if I have Jay-Z or Drake or Lil Wayne or Beyonce or whomever it might be, whoever your favorite artist is, who begins to talk about an issue, begins to share about an issue, it's going to get everyone's attention. We have to remember that, folks like Common, right? We know Common as a great actor, as a rapper and other things. Common did this song called Trouble in the Water, which talked about the Flint water crisis, but took it even further than that to talk about all these different impacts that are happening in the water space. And I remember being in a school with a number of kids, and I played that video, and they were like, wow, I see somebody who looks like me, who's talking about, water quality and water pollution issues, and little kids then coming up and saying, you know what, I wanna do more in that space. How can I learn more about this? And that's just one example. Sometimes it's a great poet. Sometimes it's the visual arts, right? That can say so much more than 10,000 words being shared with, someone. But it's that one picture that captures you and connects you to the issue. And then you have an opportunity because the mind's doors are open, right? And that's the game changer. Or if you close your eyes and you remember how whatever your favorite song is made you feel, imagine if you can infuse that energy, that type of paradigm into these really important sets of challenges and opportunities that we're dealing with. That's powerful. You can do some transformative things when it's done in an authentic way. And that's why I say, the environmental / climate movement, has to better engage with creatives. And we will use that energy to keep moving forward so that we can actually win on these issues that so many of us have dedicated our lives to.
Mustafa, thank you for joining me this morning. It was so inspiring, as always, to talk with you. And I look forward to seeing you in person again in hopefully the near future.
Thank you. It's a blessing. And thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.